Good evening. Welcome to the 2023 Zena Sutherland Lecture at Chicago Public Library's Harold Washington Library Center. My name is Shelley Hughes, and I am the Director of Children's Services and Family Engagement here at CPL. On behalf of the library, the University of Chicago, and the Zena Sutherland Committee, we'd like to welcome you to tonight's lecture with Zetta Elliott. So the program for this evening consists of Zetta's lecture, I Am Myrtilla's Daughter, Weaving Scotland, Slavery, and Siths into Historical Fantasies, followed by a question and answer session hosted by Ann Carlson. And following the presentation, we invite those of you who are with us here in person to join us for a reception in the grand lobby on the ground level, which is right upstairs, to celebrate her work. It's been some time since we've been together in person, and this is our first time hosting this event in a hybrid format. So we're pleased to see you, whether you're here in the Cindy Pritzker Auditorium or joining us from a far-flung land, or maybe just the comfort of your couch. So a few housekeeping notes. Restrooms are located here in the lower level lobby. They're right outside this door. A gender-inclusive restroom and a mother's room are available in the Thomas Hughes Children's Library on the second floor. If you need access to either of those, please let one of our uniformed security officers know. They'll get you an escort up there since the library is actually closed for the evening. A link to the recording of tonight's lecture will be sent to everyone who registered, whether you're with us virtually or in person, so you'll be able to watch it again if you want. And now that we've squared away those details, for a little background about Zena Sutherland herself, we'd like to show you this video recorded by Roger Sutton, editor emeritus of the Horn Book. Following that, Elisa Gall of the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools will introduce Zetta Elliott.
Many of the librarians and teachers in the audience tonight would be able to tell you about the one professor who pointed them toward a career bringing children and books together, who in fact is the reason they are here tonight. For me and for any number of other librarians, including Carla Hayden, the current Librarian of Congress, that professor was Zena Sutherland, who taught children's and young adult literature at the University of Chicago's Graduate Library School from 1972 until her retirement in 1986. She served even longer as editor of the Bulletin of the Center for Children's Books, assuming that position in the late 1950s. Now, I don't know what you civilians think happens in a children's literature class, but try to picture a tiny blonde woman in a psychedelic shift dress, chain-smoking Carltons, while an entire room of grad students hung on her every word. She used her own textbook, Children and Books, which she had taken over from Grande Dame Mayhill Arbuthnot, but that comprehensive book was just the structure on which Zena built a bravura performance that was one part wisdom, one part common sense, and one part stand-up, along with a running commentary that contained some of the juiciest gossip in the children's book business, all delivered in a whiskey contralto. She was also patient and kind and helpful with her students, who imbibed Zena's unsentimental approach to bringing children and books together, and her openness to the great changes that were happening in books for young people in the 1960s and 70s. Zena's students, and in subsequent years, their students, spread the Zena gospel far and wide. As Zena's retirement approached, two of her doctoral students, Marilyn Kay and Betsy Hearn, who would succeed Zena in 1985, planned a surprise. Secretly, they had solicited and edited essays from just about everybody who was anybody in children's books at the time. Ursula Nordstrom, Susan Cooper, Virginia Hamilton, Lloyd Alexander, Arnold Lobel, and more, and put them all in a book complete with a cover by Zena's great pal, Maurice Sendak. That book, celebrating children's books, Essays on Children's Literature in honor of Zena Sutherland, was published in 1981 by Lothrop Lee and Shepard, and all of its proceeds were donated by the publisher, contributors, and Marilyn and Betsy to establish the Zena Sutherland Lecture. Zena died in 2002, but we are happy to continue this lectureship series in her honor. On behalf of the Sutherland Lectureship Committee, I would like to thank Betsy and Marilyn for getting this going, the University of Chicago, the Chicago Public Library, and the Hornbook for their steadfast support, our faithful audience for coming back year after year, the publishers who helped make each lecture evening possible, and the authors and illustrators who have given us so much insight into not only their own craft, but into the value young people's literature brings to our culture as a whole. Militant atheist Zena will probably get me for saying this, but I hope she is up there smiling. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Poet, playwright, essayist, publisher, puppeteer, activist, author, scholar, teacher, storyteller, neighbor, friend. No matter the form, Dr. Zetta Elliott's work is multifaceted, honest, and significant. Being that this is a children's literature lecture, I find myself pulled to list all of the literary awards Zetta Elliott's books have won and recognition she has received. It is a pleasure and not a surprise to share that this list is just too long for this short introduction. It's not every day one gets to hear from someone who has been nominated for the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award, which is the world's largest children's literature award, twice. Through her writing, research, and teaching, Elliott explores important, necessary, and intersecting themes and issues, including anti-racism, feminism, class solidarity, disability justice, and more, with clarity, complexity, criticality, and integrity. What's more, she is one of the most radically kid-centric authors I have ever met. I have seen firsthand the impact of her work. Just one example. A few years ago, when Zetta Elliott learned about a beautiful Black Lives Matter and Breonna Taylor memorial that some of my kindergarten students at the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools had made with their teacher, Tracy Aiden, she visited the memorial and read their words. She bore witness when their memorial was vandalized. And when Elliott was writing about our school's neighborhood, Hyde Park, into her book, The Witch's Apprentice, she made the children's memorial and some of their words and signs as part of the story. She wrote them into the book, and she used her talents to honor and uplift the children's activism and ideas. Tonight's lecture is intended for adults, but one of the aspects of Zetta's work, one of the many aspects of Zetta's work that I am inspired by is how she respects children, their autonomy, their truths, their voices, their neighborhoods, their joy, and their futures. This is all for them, and she gets that. She doesn't just tell children that they matter, she believes it. And her work, no matter the medium, demonstrates a fierce commitment to that belief. It is a great honor to introduce Zetta Elliott for the 40th annual Zena Sutherland Lecture.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Elisa. Oh, good evening. So I'm not sure if you do call and response, but I'll try that again. Good evening. Hey, that's great. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the Chicago Public Library, the University of Chicago, and the Zena Sutherland Lectureship Committee for hosting this annual event. I am honored to be with you tonight to deliver the 2023 Zena Sutherland Lecture. My talk this evening is titled, I Am Myrtilla's Daughter, Weaving Scotland, Slavery, and She into Historical Fantasies. I am going to try my best to pronounce Gaelic, we would say Gaelic words correctly, and apologize in advance for the mistakes I am likely to make. I'll share a clearer image of Myrtilla's tombstone later in my presentation, which should run about an hour. I went through all my albums this week and discovered some fun photographs, like this one of me with my older sister, Karen. We're wearing one of our mother's matching fashion creations. I don't know if all kids wore kilts in the 1970s or if it was a Canadian colonial thing, but it shows how Scottish culture has been a part of my life from a very early age. I feel I ought to begin by addressing the elephant in the room. I'm sure many of you saw the announcement a month ago and wondered, who is Zetta Elliott? I was also surprised by my nomination and did not expect to face a large audience tonight. A few Chicago authors made a point of telling me how well-attended past lectures have been. Neil Gaiman did the Sutherland, and I thought I could hear in their voices a hint of confusion. How did she get this gig? I have no idea. Only the nominating committee can explain why I'm up here tonight. It might have something to do with the unavailability or expense of celebrity authors. It might be that the committee shares the secret mission of the unknown, irrationally optimistic party that keeps nominating me for the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award. This year's winner was Laurie Halse Anderson. Well-deserved honor for her. I am realistic about my profile within the children's literature or kidlit community. My books have earned a few prizes, but I haven't won any of the major awards like the Newbery, the National Book Award, or the Coretta Scott King Award. Of my 42 titles for young readers, 2/3 had to be self-published. I struggled to find an agent, and they struggle to place my many manuscripts with traditional publishers who often find my work too sad. A prospective fifth agent recently asked me how many books I've sold over the course of my career. And when I tallied the numbers, the total neared 600,000. But none of my books have ever made the New York Times bestseller list. I don't really do social media. I'm not adept at firing clever clapbacks on Twitter and haven't made a viral TikTok video that landed me on late night television. So, like so many other authors, however, I have had to deal with book banners, though on a relatively small scale. Last year, my picture book, A Place Inside of Me, A Poem to Heal the Heart, was challenged in Virginia by a parent whose child thought it was about skateboards. Spoiler alert, it's not. My poem, written 20 years ago and beautifully illustrated by Noah Denman, who won the Caldecott Honor Award for her debut, shows the range of emotions experienced by a Black boy after the police-involved shooting of a girl in his community. When the school principal in Hanover County decided to keep our book on the shelves, a local elected official got involved, taking to social media to call our book garbage and implying that it is anti-police. The progressive members of the community responded by inviting me to be a special guest at their inaugural book festival. I traveled to Richmond, did a school visit, signed books at the Book Bar, a Black-owned bookstore, and I spoke to the press. One reporter from a Black newspaper asked to talk to me, but about 20 minutes into the phone interview, he abruptly asked, "Why aren't you famous?" My flustered response must have been inadequate because his piece never ran in the paper. I begin with this anecdote because I would like us this evening to consider the way fame and visibility shape systems of recognition. When I do school visits, students sometimes approach me to ask, "Are you famous?" And I always reply, "If I were famous, you wouldn't have to ask." It seems that kids aren't entirely sure what fame is, but they know from an early age that it makes a person important. I don't generally have a problem writing in relative obscurity. I realized a long time ago that the kinds of stories I produce aren't generally valued by the market, and part of getting ahead means playing the game, which to me is clearly rigged. Fame was never a professional goal of mine. Instead, I aspired to what I have very nearly achieved: sovereignty and security. The commercial success of my Dragons in a Bag series enables me to write what I want, when I want, how I want, without having to worry about sales. And I have to say, please don't take a picture of this, because this is the not quite final cover for book 5, which will come out next May, and a prequel is underway. When another white mother in Tennessee tried to have a place inside of me pulled from the shelves, this time because she claimed it made her child think that Black people are inferior, she went before the school board and nostalgically yearned for the good old days when children's books were about chickens. So I made her a book about a chicken, which is, of course, all about decentering whiteness and giving everyone an equal opportunity to tell their story their way. My kid-lit friend, Laura Jimenez, called it meta and cutely disruptive. Perfect description. I donated 100 copies to the 2 counties where my book was challenged. It seemed a fitting way to thank community members whose pressure ultimately kept a place inside of me in kids' hands. I probably won't ever earn enough in sales to cover the cost of self-publishing Chicken Wonders Why, and that's okay. The point was to affirm my values by crafting a narrative that demonstrates the power of stories to connect rather than divide us. During the pandemic, I discovered a guilty pleasure on HBO. The Other Two is a comedy about Brooke and Carrie Dubeck, 2 adult siblings living in the shadow of their adolescent brother, Chase, who achieves sudden superstardom when his homemade music video goes viral. He's given a record deal, but when it becomes clear that Chase can't actually sing, his savvy, scheming publicist, played brilliantly by Wanda Sykes, finds other ways to capitalize on his popularity. Meanwhile, Carrie's acting career is stalled because he can't even get an audition without having at least 50,000 followers on social media. Brooke helps manage Chase's career, overbooking him even when she can see that he's unhappy. She ditches her loser boyfriend, Lance, only to watch him find mega success as a designer of unwearable luxury sneakers. Their mother's warm personality wins her a daytime talk show, but Pat's desire to please others leaves her exhausted and exploited by an entertainment industry that manipulates and monetizes everything. The Other Two is a hilarious take on 21st century celebrity culture and a sobering reminder that meritocracy is a myth. Chase's lack of talent is no barrier to his continued success because he has a team of people working to ensure that he remains a highly visible, lucrative commodity. Brooke and Carrie don't want to live in their little brother's shadow, but can't succeed in their own careers without buying into the very system they despise. Fame brings wealth and access to opportunity, but it also leads to envy and isolation. Each family member has to decide what they're willing to sacrifice to achieve professional success. Now, I don't mean to suggest that all famous people lack talent. Obviously, many artists are rightfully recognized for their brilliance, but a recent article in Poets and Writers, Literary Prizes Under Scrutiny, confirms what many writers of color already know. The article summarizes the findings of two studies conducted by Claire Grossman, Juliana Spar, and Stephanie Young, poet researchers whose survey of U.S. literary prizes for adult fiction reveals that these awards are, quote, increasingly powerful shaping mechanisms, which give select writers, quote, attention, a wider readership, and professional opportunities. The number of literary prizes has increased exponentially since the start of the 20th century, going from 1 in 1918 up to 80 in 2020. Yet it wasn't until the 1990s that writers of color finally began to win recognition for their work. But the vast majority of those winners hold graduate degrees from MFA programs at elite schools. And since, quote, literary production in the United States remains disproportionately white, these prizes do not fundamentally change, quote, a still exclusionary literary landscape, offering only a limited, curated version of diversity, according to the researchers. Most writers never win an award for their work, and most can't earn a living by writing full-time. Despite the challenges I have faced, I consider myself fortunate. After teaching at the college level for almost a decade, I quit my last professor job in 2014 and eventually found my footing after struggling financially for the first few years. I am not famous, but I am doing okay. A friend recently asked if I felt there was a conspiracy to exclude me from certain kidlit conferences. I have undoubtedly annoyed certain influential individuals, and I'm sure there are writers who find it professionally disadvantageous to publicly fraternize with me. At 50, I am too old to be discovered in an industry fixated on what's new, what's now, and what's next. But it is fascinating to witness those powerful shaping mechanisms that allow other writers and their behind-the-scene teams to capitalize on their fame and build empires that extend beyond publishing into other branches of the entertainment industry. I grew up with the fraught legacy of the British Empire and harbor no imperialist ambitions myself. When I left Canada, I wanted nothing more than to become African American. As a child, teen, and young adult, I consumed, studied, and adored British literature. Charles Dickens was my particular favorite, and I strove to write like him. I started grad school at NYU in 1995, when a friend from Detroit read a story of mine and declared that it sounded so British, I was mortified. I was just beginning to decolonize my imagination, a challenging process I described in my 2010 Hornbook essay. I eventually came to realize that hybridity for me would always be so much more than biraciality. I could not outrun or entirely reject my British heritage. My affection for some aspects of the culture imposed on me and my ancestors did not nullify my rage, but I felt at ease only when I embraced the complexity of colonialism. Living in New York City helped, since many African and Caribbean immigrants from previously colonized countries were navigating the same choppy waters. But it was here in Chicago that I finally became a US citizen in 2021 after living in this country for almost 30 years. I'm also a citizen of Canada and St. Kitts Nevis, talk about privilege, where my father was born, a subject of the King of England in 1941. He migrated to Canada as a teenager, but was not welcome in his stepmother's home. My grandfather tried unsuccessfully to enlist my dad in the army, and then Aunt Ellen stepped in to save the day. She had been a member of the Pilgrim Holiness Church in Nevis, and so sought out the same denomination when she emigrated to Toronto. When her 15-year-old nephew needed a plan for his life, Ellen found a way for him to attend the affiliated Pilgrim High School and Bible College in Allentown, Pennsylvania. She appealed to the congregation for help with housing, and a tiny Scottish woman Nellie Mackay, which would be pronounced Mackay in Scotland, offered to host my father in her Toronto home when he wasn't boarding at school in the US. My maternal grandfather, it's him on the far right, was minister of that Pilgrim Holiness Church. It's where my parents met, and when they married, Nellie became Grandma Mackay, my Scottish granny. Here I am, clearly telling her something very important. I don't know much about her, where in Scotland she was born, or when she left for Canada. I only know that she taught my mother how to make Yorkshire pudding. She had a son named Fred who towered over her like a giant, and she knit cardigans for my brother, sister, and me. She attended my dad's graduation in Allentown in 1966, and when Grandma Mackay died, my father wept as if he had lost his mother again. I am named after his biological mother, Rosetta Elliott, who died in an asylum in Antigua a year before my father moved to Canada. I have no photograph of Zetta, only Aunt Ellen's memory that my grandmother had, quote, hair down her back. I learned early on how to live with shameful silences and unexplained absences. One strategy was to escape into a book where families were whole, happy, and complete. Another was to make up stories that filled the many uncomfortable gaps in my own reality. Thanks to my steady diet of British fiction, when I did dream of running away, I dreamed of England. I had the opportunity to study abroad while I was in college and jumped at the chance to visit England in 1991. Though I couldn't afford to stay in Arundel for the whole academic year, I did manage to visit Wales and Scotland that fall. I remember Edinburgh being windy and sunny, and I had gingerbread, the cake, not the cookie, for the first time. I returned to the UK again and again over the years, sometimes as a tourist, sometimes as a scholar presenting at conferences, and more recently as an author conducting research for my books. In 2018, I began to think seriously about moving to Scotland after attending a publishing conference in Edinburgh. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon made a surprise appearance, so the conference organizers asked us to store our bags in the cloakroom. It doesn't lock, they admitted, but we'll have someone keep an eye on your things. Everyone else complied without hesitation, so I did too. We then went upstairs to hear the First Minister's speech, and I marveled at the ease of this unexpected encounter with the Scottish leader. There were no metal detectors, no wands, no dogs, no pat-downs, because there was no need. Scotland had one mass shooting at Dunblane Primary School in 1996, and it never happened again, ever. As a progressive country led by a woman, Scotland was at the top of my if I ever leave the US list. New Zealand was next for the same reasons. Today, of course, both women have resigned as leaders of their respective countries, but gun control is still in effect. Then in August of 2022, I got an update from Ancestry.com. I admit I have submitted my DNA to 3 genealogical sites and gotten disparate results, so I wasn't surprised to see that they now claimed I was 37% Scottish. A few years ago, they declared I was 11% Scandinavian, which is also impossible. My mother's family is deeply invested in origin stories, and they are stories. I have no proof that they're true, but they shaped my understanding of my roots and my role in the world. I was always told that my mother's father was of Irish stock. My uncles easily adopted Irish accents when impersonating their elders, though my grandfather, his parents, and his grandparents were all born in Canada, not in Ireland. My maternal grandmother presented as white, but identified as Negro, and prided herself on being the great-grandniece of Bishop Richard Allen, founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. She believed her great-grandfather, John Allen, was the brother of Bishop Allen. When I moved to Philly in 2018, I hired a genealogist who found several John Allens from that era, and one was an inmate at Eastern State Penitentiary. He was likely white, but I keep open the possibility that our ancestor might not have come from such an illustrious family. It was easy for me to dismiss the sudden Scandinavian results, but I did linger over the Scottish ones. I checked 23andMe, and sure enough, they too declared that I shared the most DNA with folks from Glasgow. However, this week they're saying I'm most closely related to folks in Central Ireland, so who knows? Intrigued, I reached out to a genealogist specializing in mixed Scottish and Irish heritage. She took a quick look at my family tree on Ancestry and immediately spotted a Scottish ancestor. My grandfather's paternal grandmother, Isabella Stark, listed her mother's birthplace as Scotland. I recently received a letter from my uncle letting me know that my grandfather's mother, Jenny Caldwell, was also of Scottish descent, the MacDougall clan, according to my uncle. So last summer, I returned to Scotland for the third time to see if it still felt like a potential home. The genealogical updates were interesting, but in some ways irrelevant. I don't feel a need to prove that I'm Scottish to justify my presence there. The transatlantic slave trade and the colonization of Canada and St. Kitts Nevis already bind me to the UK. And as Sri Lankan British activist A. Sivanandan famously remarked, quote, "We're here because you were there." I don't intend to apply for status in Scotland. I'm more interested in Paul Marshall's Tripartite Life, which saw the Caribbean American author dividing her time between 3 homes in 3 countries. I love the US and I feel lucky to live here, but I fully understand why so many Black artists have become temporary expats. Sometimes we just need a break. I do intend to hire another genealogist to trace my Scottish roots, but like many Black people, I'm not particularly curious about my white ancestors. Any I discover are likely to have been settlers who seized indigenous land and/or participated in other colonial projects that resulted in the displacement and/or enslavement of my other ancestors. So Ancestry.com sent me this once I claimed Thomas Stark as my ancestor. The land he chose was and is Algonquin territory. I have been working on an experimental memoir called The Hummingbird's Tongue for over a decade, and I promise I will reveal whatever I learn about my white folks when I finally write that book. But for now, I want to talk about historical fantasy, which is the genre of the 2 projects I'm currently working on, a picture book called Blue Boy and a hybrid verse novel, The Ship in the Garden. Just a second to shift some papers. Go. When I arrived in Glasgow last August, I had a couple of hours on my own before meeting children's literature scholar and author Brianna McDaniel for high tea at my hotel. Bree has made a sort of second home in Scotland, and I was eager to learn how my friend had forged connections and built community. After tea, Bree gave me a tour of the city center, renamed Merchant City, and she shared Glasgow's long-buried involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. The next day, I signed up for a free walking tour, fully expecting that my older white male tour guide would omit the historical facts that Bree had disclosed. But to my surprise, the guide, let's call him Bob, acknowledged the source of Glasgow's wealth from the very beginning and pointed out repurposed mansions that once belonged to tobacco lords whose fortunes were built on the backs of enslaved Africans laboring in the Caribbean and North America. He revealed that Scotland was forced to align itself with England in 1707 because almost the entire nation had invested in a failed scheme to colonize Panama. Bob also told us that some Glaswegian merchants were so wealthy they paid to have sidewalks laid for their own private use, and doors had to be widened to allow servants to carry their masters inside on sedan chairs. Near the end of the tour, Bob stopped in Virginia Court to tell us a heartbreaking story about an enslaved boy named Frederick who was given away by a tobacco merchant. Bob told us that merchants often offered incentives to get traders to buy loose leaves of tobacco after all the bales had been sold, like a pineapple or a bottle of port. But one heartless Scot gave the child away instead. According to Bob, whose true passion was acting, Frederick managed to escape from his new enslaver, but no one knew what ultimately happened to the little boy. When the tour ended, I tipped the guide rather generously and went back to the hotel to write a glowing review online. For months in Chicago, I had been hearing two words in my mind: blue boy, blue boy. It happens sometimes. Before I moved into my Hyde Park apartment in 2021, I visited the neighborhood and heard over and over again, "There's a boy in the lake. There's a boy in the lake." Within a few weeks, I sat down at my desk and wrote The Boy in the Lake, a graphic novel about Emmett Till gathering Chicago's murdered children in Lake Michigan. My blue boy remained a mystery for months until I reached Glasgow last summer, took that tour, and heard Frederick's sad story. I revisited Virginia Court on my own, took more photos, and tried to imagine what could have happened to that poor child. We know well enough from our own contemporary standpoint what happens to vulnerable children who lack protectors. Earlier this year, it was revealed that in the UK, asylum-seeking children were being abducted by human traffickers from the hotels where they had been placed by the government. In this country, migrant children who cross the border unaccompanied are working in dangerous conditions on construction sites, in factories, and slaughterhouses. I kept asking myself, why would the merchant simply give away a valuable young slave who could be exploited for the duration of his life? Was Frederick related to the trader, an illegitimate child, likely a product of rape? Perhaps it was simply inconvenient to have him around. Did my blue boy have a disability that made him less productive as a worker in the eyes of an enslaver? Did he contract an illness and weaken, leaving the merchant inclined to dispose of him? All the possibilities I came up with were disturbing and depressing. Then the day before I left Glasgow, I visited Kelvin Grove Museum in the city's West End and saw a striking 1890 painting by two of the Glasgow boys, Edward Atkinson Hornell and George Henry, titled "The Druids Bringing in the Mistletoe." On the opposite wall was an 1889 painting by Hornell. It was darker and somewhat ghoulish, but equally compelling. The Brownie of Blednoch piqued my curiosity, and later that evening I pulled up the poem that inspired Hornell. Written in Scots by William Nicholson in 1825, The Brownie of Blednoch tells the story of Aiken Drum, a creature with a frightening appearance, claws, no nose, glowing eyes, who only wishes to serve a community and would do so indefinitely in exchange for a bowl of cream each night, so long as they don't offer him a new set of clothes. When one woman in the village breaks the rules, Aikendrum departs, never to be seen again. I immediately decided that my blue boy had to have an encounter with Hornell's brownie. One challenge in writing about the past is representing traumatic events truthfully without terrifying or shaming young readers. I found that a dose of magic is like the proverbial spoonful of sugar. Having Frederick find a kind of liberation through his encounter with the mythical creature seemed like an ideal way to balance the horror of child trafficking. The day after I returned to Chicago, I wrote these opening lines. Behind a wide blue door lived a wee blue boy. They called him Frederick. Frederick was not his true name, and the ground house with the blue door was not his true home. But no one in the blue boy's world seemed bothered by the truth. Within a few weeks, I had written a satisfying tale about Frederick's unhappy life with a tobacco merchant in Glasgow. When my blue boy is gifted to another trader, he winds up in a household where the servants go to bed every night without cleaning up the kitchen. Frederick sees the maid leaving a dish of cream on the back step. She explains that it is for a helpful brownie that serves their household. Suspicious of such an arrangement, Frederick stays up and witnesses the goblin-like creature claiming his meager reward. Undaunted by the brownie's appearance, Frederick welcomes him inside and watches as he gets to work. When the dishes have been done and the kitchen is spotless, the brownie lights his pipe and sits by the fire. He explains that he left his last household after the farmer and his wife presented him with a fine set of clothes. Frederick timidly asks whether the clothes would also make him disappear. There's only one way to find out, the brownie cries before leading Frederick into the glen and over to an old oak tree where he stashed his fine clothes. Frederick puts them on and instantly disappears, and the brownie returns to the manor house alone. I decided I would add an author's note and a study guide to help readers further explore Scotland's ties to slavery. There was just one problem. When I searched online for sources to support my tour guide's story, nothing came up. I looked into Virginia Court and discovered that it was built in 1814, but Glasgow's tobacco heyday ended in the 1770s with the start of the Revolutionary War. Slavery was deemed inconsistent with Scottish law in 1778, and the transatlantic trade in slaves was abolished in 1807. So how likely was it that a tobacco trader would still have an enslaved child in the early 18th century? I reached out to a historian with expertise in slavery in Scotland. Now based nearby in Wisconsin, Professor Simon Newman introduced me by email to Dr. Stephen Mullen, a professor at the University of Glasgow. Together, they had collaborated to produce a report for the university detailing the philanthropic donations made to the school over the centuries that could be linked to slavery. Dr. Mullen kindly shared his research with me, which revealed that there was a Caribbean boy named Frederick who was trafficked into Scotland in 1762 by none other than James Watt, famed Scottish inventor of a more efficient steam engine that was used widely during the Industrial Revolution. Watt had many jobs over his lifetime, and as a young man served as an agent in his father's trading company, which did business in North America and the Caribbean. Apparently, the Watts were asked to procure a boy for Lady Spiney of Brodie House in the Highlands. Keeping an enslaved boy to serve as a page, an accessory really, was the fashion in 18th century Scotland. When the boy failed to arrive, the Brodies wrote to Watt and complained. Other correspondence discovered by Mullen revealed a description of the clothes Frederick had been wearing when he was last seen. Breeches, a waistcoat, a black cravat, shoes, and a blue coat. It was clear to me at this point that Bob, my actor/tour guide, had taken more than a few liberties with the facts. I tried reaching out to the tour guide company, but got no response, and so resolved to track Bob down when I returned to Glasgow for my birthday in late October. I went back to George Square, where the tours meet each morning, but couldn't see Bob anywhere. I asked one of his colleagues if he was still working, and she directed me to the Riverside Museum, where Bob was doing a Halloween show. I bought a ticket for the nearby hop-on, hop-off bus and went over to the museum. Bob came out of the tent dressed like a vampire and listened patiently as I explained my project. There were a lot of things I could have said that day, but I kept my tone light and just asked if he would be willing to share his sources for the tale he had told during our tour. I gave him my card and left the museum, not expecting to ever hear from Bob again, and knowing I would likely have to revise my picture book story. To my surprise, Bob did send me an email the next day. There was no message, no apology, just a link to a newspaper article about historian Stephen Mullen's research into James Watt. I don't know if Bob is still conducting tours in Merchant City, or if he felt at all ashamed of having his elaborate fabrication exposed. In my more generous moments, I think Bob's heart was probably in the right place. Perhaps he felt Frederick could be made a more sympathetic figure by adding a bit more drama to his story. I, too, am adding fantastic elements to reshape my Blue Boys narrative. Of course, the difference is that we don't expect tour guides to lie to us, do we? They tell jokes and stretch the truth, but always with a wink and a nod. Wanda Sykes' character and the other two would argue that all publicity is good publicity. To my knowledge, there are no monuments to Frederick in Glasgow, though I saw at least 3 of James Watt. Only one at the University of Glasgow's Hunterian Museum had a placard beside it acknowledging Watt's ties to the slave trade. Last month, my publisher flew me to Austin for the Texas Library Association's annual conference. While waiting to board my plane, I noticed a blonde boy, no more than 10 years old, wandering through the gate area with a look of panic on his face. Just as I was about to approach the lost child, he made his way to the gate agent and asked for help. She made an announcement. The boy's embarrassed father hurried over to the counter, and they were reunited. I blinked away tears while watching this scene and immediately thought of my blue boy. If he was somehow separated from his traffickers, would Frederick know how or whom to ask for help in a strange land? Did his mother surrender her son willingly, hoping Frederick might have better opportunities abroad, or was he wrenched from her by force? If he spent the first few years of his life on a small island in the Caribbean, how would he find the long transatlantic journey and the bustling, overwhelmingly white city of Glasgow? But most of all, I wondered, Frederick, why aren't you famous? What powerful shaping mechanisms operated to elevate the enslaver, James Watt, while entirely erasing the child he enslaved? What sort of team would we need to assemble to ensure that this Black child's harrowing narrative, obscured for over 250 years, is never forgotten again? An agent or a publicist wouldn't likely take an interest in a long deceased child of whom there is no visual or written evidence that might easily be adapted and monetized into misery porn. Could a social media influencer make Frederick a household name, in Scotland at the very least? Or is it best to take a guerrilla graffiti artist approach and tag every statue, portrait, textbook, institution, and website that even mentions Watt's name? Stephen Mulling's findings certainly created a stir when first published in 2020. I'm doing what I can, but without an agent of my own and with 24 unpublished picture book manuscripts still languishing on my hard drive, I'm not much of an asset to my blue boy. My unconventional fairy tale has what I consider to be a happy ending, but I expect many editors here in the US would conclude, as they often do, that my picture book is simply too sad. A friend in Glasgow shared the names and email addresses of 4 Scottish children's book editors. 2 responded to my initial query last fall, but there has only been silence since. The only upside of facing 2 decades of rejection in children's publishing is that I am generally prepared to self-publish everything I write. My academic librarian friend, Edith Campbell, helped me find an online database of Black Scottish artists. I reached out to Jacqueline Briggs, an illustrator based in Inverness, and commissioned a portrait of my blue boy. Jacqueline captured his sadness perfectly and agreed to do the remaining illustrations. We're hoping to have the book finished sometime this summer. Of course, self-published books generally do not get reviewed, added to library collections, or carried in bookstores. Would Scottish readers flock to Amazon to buy a picture book written by a Black woman from North America? I don't know. UK children's literature does not yet reflect the rich diversity of its population. Things are gradually improving, but I don't think US cultural imperialism is the solution. In March, I met a white woman teacher who actually grew up a decade after me in the same part of Canada. She shared that her students had just finished a unit on Jewel Parker Road's Ghost Boys, and I felt my smile falter. In my suburban Toronto high school, we read American classics, To Kill a Mockingbird, A Streetcar Named Desire, Catcher in the Rye. Just one Canadian author, Robertson Davies, made the ELA curriculum, and not until my senior year, We never read any Indigenous writers or authors of color, and I didn't discover any Black Canadian authors until after I graduated from college. As a teen, I would have loved to read African-American authors in English class, but those books likely would have been windows more than mirrors, to borrow Rudine Sims Bishop's metaphor. Ideally, all students should have both, with priority given to writers from their own country. One thing I have learned over the course of my writing career is that a book cannot serve anyone unless it exists. My indie titles have circulated in ways I never could have imagined. One 2017 middle grade novel, The Ghosts in the Castle, will be included in an exhibit at the Bodleian Library at Oxford University this summer. My scholar friend Maria Sashiko Sasir has written about my novel, and her essay will appear in the accompanying book. I grew up reading novels set in castles in England, but my own novel introduces young readers to 4 Black characters. Zaria is from Brooklyn, Winston is from Brixton, and the ghosts they meet while touring Windsor Castle are 2 African children made wards of Queen Victoria in the 19th century, Sarah Forbes Bonetta and Prince Alamayu. Sarah has learned how to move freely through the world since her death, but Alamayu remains trapped in Windsor Castle. It's up to the 2 contemporary children to find 3 things that will remind the prince of his home so that he can finally return to Ethiopia. I am fascinated by the past, but I am not a historian. I rely on the research that professionals publish and treat their meticulous findings like a sumptuous buffet. I take small bites of select dishes. When I'm writing historical fiction, I generally use just 10 to 15% of my research. Any more than that, and the narrative becomes burdened by facts. I've been writing historical fantasy for 20 years. When I realized that most teens don't share my passion for the past, I began to write stories that deployed conventional tropes in unconventional ways. My novelette, Mother of the Sea, was selected by Maria Sasir for the ALA's Great Stories Club for Teens. It features a mischievous child who leads a rebellion on board a slave ship that is ultimately destroyed by a vengeful mermaid, the Yoruba Orisha Yamoja. A Wish After Midnight and The Door at the Crossroads are time travel novels that send 2 Brooklyn teens back to 1863 when New York City is being rocked by the draft riots. Ship of Souls and Sin's Mark center on burial grounds in New York City and Philadelphia. In both middle grade novels, an African-American boy must find allies to help him free the dead. I scared easily as a child and have never been drawn to the horror genre, but I do write a lot of ghost stories. I find it's an effective way to bring the past into the present and give voice to the countless souls whose stories have been suppressed for centuries. Before I left Glasgow last fall, I took another walking tour. This one was organized by the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights and was led by 2 people of color. I later discovered that Nelson Cummins, pictured here, whose mother is from St. Kitts, is likely my cousin. We met at Glasgow Cathedral on a rainy Saturday morning and began by examining the statue of renowned Scottish explorer David Livingstone. Our guides pointed out the deeply problematic depictions at the base of this monument and several others that were hiding in plain sight. It was enlightening to see the city through the lens they held up to history, and I trusted their interpretation of the facts. At the end of the tour, Nelson mentioned Pollock House, a stately home in the city that was popular with wedding planners. When Nelson explained the Sterling Maxwell family's wealth was partly derived from past ownership of plantations in Jamaica and St. Kitts Nevis, I went back to the hotel and tried to find out more. I discovered that I had missed the deadline for a 6-week autumn storytelling residency at Pollock House, part of an initiative called Facing the Past, which, quote, explores the connections between National Trust for Scotland properties and historic enslavement. This residency had my name written all over it. Here's what it required. Create a suite of between 4 and 6 stories, exploring the connections between Pollock House, the Sterling Maxwell family, and the transatlantic slave system. Your stories may explore African people's experiences, focusing on creating empathy and describing a history of resistance despite gaps in the archive. 2, develop at least 2 stories that will speak specifically to young audiences. We imagine age ranges of 5 to 10 years old and 10 to 15 years old. 3, design and deliver an immersive, inclusive events program that will unveil the stories to visitors and team members. This program could utilize a range of artistic mediums, including installations, theater, visual arts, and more. I immediately sent a query to the visitor service manager listed on the website and got no reply. I went ahead and submitted my application materials a few days later, no reply. 2 months went by and I decided to approach the woman's supervisor. Couldn't find an email address, so reached out on Twitter and got a prompt reply asking me to contact him after the holidays. I did, and within a couple of weeks was told that the lack of response to my initial queries was due to an administrative error and that the residency was now closed. I asked about the children's books that were supposed to be published by the trust, and once again, got no reply. So I decided to self-fund my own residency and returned to Glasgow for 3 weeks this past March. I felt better prepared for this visit. I knew how to pack, how to dress for the changeable Scottish weather. I knew how to budget. I had a couple of contacts from previous visits that I could reach out to if I needed support. I understood the basic layout of the city. I knew how to take the train and easily made the 10-minute journey to Pollokshaws West, where Pollock Country Park is located. The park contains Pollock House, the Burrell Collection, and a few shaggy Highland cattle. It's a beautiful expanse full of old trees, exuberant birds, and countless daffodils. I confess I am easily swayed by beauty and had to remind myself to remain vigilant. When I first visited Scotland as a teenager in the 1990s, I toured Palace of Holyrood House and marveled at its opulence. Stately homes no longer impress me now that I know the source of many British families' wealth is tied to the slave trade and/or the compensation they received from the government when slavery was finally abolished. Of course, the formerly enslaved got nothing. I annually participate in National Poetry Writing Month, but decided that while I was in Scotland, I would write a poem a day for the month of March as well. Mostly, I wrote several haiku every evening as a way of documenting my impressions and discoveries. The haiku's form forces me to wrestle with complex contradictions using just 3 lines and 17 syllables. The suite enables me to link essential ideas into something like a narrative. Sunlight seduces the heart smoldering with rage, turning pain to ash. Yet our ancestors labored beneath blazing suns. Their fury flourished. So guard your anger against birdsong and blossoms. Beauty can block blame. My first tour of Pollock House was full of surprises. The website indicated that tickets were no longer available, but it wasn't due to demand. I could count on one hand the number of other visitors there that Friday. Rather extensive water damage was evident as soon as I entered the first room of the 18th century mansion, which I found rather satisfying. A sign admitting the family's connection to the slave trade contained more than one error. Sir James Maxwell, 7th Baronet, was listed as Sir John, and visitors were told he was an overseer on a plantation in Jamaica rather than St. Kitts, a strange way to face the past. In the library, a docent informed me that of the 7,000 titles in the collection, just one was a work of fiction, and it was a collection of ghost stories. I took notes as I walked around the main floor and found the docents to be friendly and helpful. I asked about the fairy garden, which I had spotted on a map even before I left Chicago, and was given a sheet with printed directions. They seemed fairly straightforward, but the formal gardens are terraced, and after a few wrong turns and flights of stairs, I found myself confronted by a ship in the garden. My mouth fell open and I immediately reached for my phone so I could take photographs of the replica merchant ship with its obvious Christian overtones. I sat for a while on one of the many memorial benches that lined the square hedged area, and then I resumed my search for the fairy garden. I eventually reached what could more accurately be described as a hobbit village. I climbed a steep mound at the very top of the sloping garden and found the burned out shell of a massive tree. Helen, the docent from the library, later told me it was called the witch's tree and that children used to tie ribbons around its branches to make wishes come true. Angus, another docent at Pollock House, told me the beech tree was 300 years old and had been struck by lightning long ago, but the charred wood I saw was likely the result of arson. When I returned for my second tour of Pollock House, I stopped a groundsman and asked if he knew anything about the ship, when it had been built and why. He said, "Let's ask Neil," and led me into the employees only section of the garden, where a carpenter told me he hadn't designed the ship, but had built it up from a rowboat about 10 years ago. It was meant to honor the Sterling Maxwell family's history as transatlantic merchants. I didn't tell him that it reminded me of a slave ship and that that's how I would represent it in my novel. At this point, I had so much material that it felt as if my story was practically writing itself. Each time I returned to Pollock House in the Gardens, I found new things to add. Sometimes I felt my blood boiling, and other times I chatted amiably with the helpful docents or other park visitors who called the sunny square garden with the ship a sun trap. I had originally planned to incorporate a fairy into my novel and learned from this 17th century treatise that the Gaelic word for fairy was spelled Sith but pronounced she. But then I took a 3-day tour of the Isle of Skye. I visited the famous fairy pools and the fairy glen, and at the end of a very rainy day, a bestiary I found in a bookstore in Portree introduced me to the Urisk. Described as a type of water brownie from the Highlands, the Urisk is a lonely creature who craves companionship, but humans shrink from them due to their unusual appearance. I was going to read an excerpt from the ship in the garden, but I think it might make more sense if I read the summary instead, so you can see how I pieced these elements together. During a school field trip to Pollock House, 13-year-old Kofi is paired with his racist tormentor, Gavin. Kofi is new at St. Mike's, and rumors have spread about his suspension from Jameson, an elite private school. To ease his transition and offer protection, Kofi's Ghanaian grandmother gives him an amulet to wear around his neck. Kofi promises Nana never to take it off, but the talisman doesn't seem to help since Gavin continues to bully him daily. When Kofi witnesses Gavin's theft of a book from the Pollock House library, he decides not to report it. But Kofi later finds the book lying open in the garden with blood smeared on its pages. Kofi worries that something bad has happened to Gavin since he also had a near-death experience after discovering a replica merchant ship in the garden. When Kofi shares his suspicions with a classmate, Kaylee insists that Gavin's disappearance is deserved, maybe even karma. But Kofi feels bound to Gavin, and so he returns to the garden and is stunned when he meets a Urisk who admits to using Gavin as an offering to resurrect a beloved Caribbean friend who died at Pollock House while serving as a page boy to the Maxwell family. To save Gavin from a life of enslavement in the Caribbean of the past, Kofi must make a deal with the same witch who tricked the Urisk. But the only thing Kofi has that the witch wants is the powerful amulet Nana intended for his protection. This upper middle grade hybrid verse novel uses Afro-urban magic to bring the past into the present while merging African diasporic and European magical traditions. Scotland has begun to explore its ties to the transatlantic slave trade, but many prominent families still refuse to acknowledge the origin of their wealth. Not only did Sir James Maxwell work as an overseer on a plantation in St. Kitts, he also brought the wealth of his bride to the estate. Fanny Colquhoun inherited the proceeds of her father's plantations in St. Kitts and neighboring Nevis. When the historical record is incomplete and or obscured, speculative fiction fills in the gaps and offers readers access to the interior lives of marginalized people. The 3 teen characters in The Ship in the Garden each represent corners of the triangular trade: West Africa, the Caribbean, and Scotland. Though Kofi's ancestors may have been victims of the slave trade, in the 21st century, he finds himself acting as a broker, trading with a mythical creature for the freedom of his vulnerable classmate. Kaylee, a mixed-race transgender girl of Kantitian descent, is determined to live authentically, something Gavin has been afraid to do. When Kofi shares with Kaylee the power of his grandmother's amulet, she suggests he use it instead in service of the enslaved children brought to Scotland and lost to history. But Kofi fears Gavin's racist beliefs make him more of a threat to Blacks in the 18th century, and so he enters the Urisk's watery realm to negotiate for his classmates' release. Like my picture book Blue Boy, The Ship in the Garden is a project I fully expect I will have to self-publish. Though my tour guide / cousin Nelson, I connected with Show Racism, the Red Card Scotland, and they took me to visit a class at Holyrood Secondary School. They were interested in my novel and offered some great suggestions, so there might be a market for my book, albeit small. I don't generally think about markets and sales when I'm writing, but I have to when looking for an agent, because being a good writer simply isn't enough. So far, all the UK agents I've queried have either not responded or politely declined. I've been down this road too many times to be surprised or even angry. I saved my rage for things like this. Not sure how easy that is for you to read, so I'll try reading it. The bottom paragraph says, in the 1700s, a small number of enslaved Africans were brought to Scotland, often as personal servants accompanying a master returning from the colonies. Although leading very different lives to plantation slaves, they were nonetheless the private property of their master. Some of these servants are known to have been made to wear brass or silver collars like the one you can see here and in the painting below. Would my Blue Boy have been forced to wear such a collar? In March, I considered heading north to see the manor house where Frederick was meant to be enslaved. I just Googled Lady Spiny Brodie House, and believe it or not, this luxury real estate listing popped up. I sent it to historian Stephen Mullen. He did a little digging and said he was fairly certain this was indeed Frederick's intended destination. I don't hate Scotland for what it did to Frederick, but I do hate that Canada was part of an empire in which it was perfectly acceptable to make my Caribbean immigrant father don this obscene Orientalist outfit to serve white women tea at the King Edward Hotel in the late 1950s. I made great tips at that job, my father told me when I first saw this photograph. I was in grad school then, and though I was working hard to shake off my family's legacy of secret keeping, I kept to myself the critique that might have hurt him even more. When I told a docent at Pollock House that I was from Nevis, Angus later followed me on Instagram and sent me a video by History Alice about an enslaved young woman from Nevis who is buried in a cemetery near Stratford-upon-Avon. Right now, I know nothing about Myrtilla besides what's written on her tombstone. Here lieth the body of Myrtilla, Negro slave to Mr. Thomas Beecham of Nevis, baptized October 20th, buried January 6th, 1705. That evening, I sat down and wrote a few haiku in her honor. I'd like to close this evening with a slightly longer poem. I am Myrtilla's daughter. I am the bishop's niece. I am the mother who wept for Frederick. I am the ancestor's instrument. I am the scribe who records all the voices. Their secrets are wreathed around my neck like lace. so that I may speak truths of inelegant iron and silvered enslavement. The collars they wore, the pain they bore, so that I could cross oceans today by choice. Thank you.
We were supposed to sit in chairs. You know, I think we're supposed to speak into these. While you're talking and while we're sitting down, it made me think of Zena. Zena's last name is Sutherland.
Yeah.
And her husband, Alec, is from Glasgow.
Wow,
Yeah, he was born and raised in Glasgow.
interesting.
And he went to work for the BBC during war. And afterwards, he had a college buddy, Alistair Cook, and they both came to the United States. So it's interesting that Zena would be very happy to hear this story.
Wow.
So we have some questions that were that came through the virtual part of. Are you getting feedback? Are you okay? Okay. So I have some questions that were posed by people on the virtual one. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
You're ready. What has been one of the challenges you have encountered as a writer?
Getting published.
Oops. I don't know.
You all can hear me? Yeah. Are we okay for Zoom if we don't use mics?
Mike? Let's go ahead and turn them on. This is, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So the biggest challenge, I would say, is definitely encountering anti-Blackness in the children's publishing industry. The industry is dominated by one group, and that is straight white cisgender women who don't have facilities. They have some conspiracy to prevent Black people from getting published, but it means many of them to lack the cultural to properly assess a lot of manuscripts. We will never know how many Black authors simply gave up and stopped sending their work out and didn't know how or who to bother to self-publish because it is a lot of work. There is stigma still attached to it. So I think that's been a big challenge. It seems as though there's a feeling within the children's literature to celebrate diversity, but everybody wants to celebrate the latest new book, especially when an author wins an award. But that celebration of progress doesn't take into account the fact that we are still really struggling to get published. We are still really struggling to get published, and you know, as the article in Poets and Writers explained, you know, having a few highly visible writers of color win awards doesn't mean that things are getting better for all writers of color. So I would say for me, it's still a challenge that you can't submit to major publishers unless you have an agent, and you can't get an agent unless you find someone who thinks they can sell your work. You know, I've never had anyone say to me, you're not a good writer, or you need to try doing X or Y. They just say, I can't sell your work. And in an industry that is based entirely around profit, that means decisions are made based on things other than merit.
So true. At this moment in time, what kind of stories do you see being the most important for young readers to have access to?
Well, all the stories that are being banned, right? Books that have LGBTQ content with transgender main characters, characters with disabilities, characters of color, written by people from those communities. Yeah, we definitely just need more of the more inclusive stories. You know, when publishers were confronted with a demand for greater diversity in children's literature, they doubled the number of books about animals.
Oh,
And that
wow.
is not the kind of diversity we were looking for. Animals are not race neutral, as Edith Campbell's really important work on monkeys in children's picture books demonstrates. So yeah, I think the books that are being banned, we need more of them, and we need to support those authors and make sure that we're participating in the debates and getting onto school boards. Make sure you're voting. If you have a school board you can vote for, we have to make sure that we push back and take up the space we deserve to hold.
Absolutely. All right. What stories should authors, publishers, librarians, educators, and parents be creating or recommending for children in today's world?
Books that reflect all children. Do an audit of your home library, your school library, your classroom library. Figure out, who the main character is, who's writing those books. Try to make sure you've got a wide range of characters and authors and illustrators and creators. Try to include some self-published books, because all of them are not awful. And because we have so much discrimination within the industry, it's important not to discriminate further against authors who are working outside of the traditional system. I think if you want to prepare your child to live in a global society, then your library, the books that you introduce them to, should reflect that. Parents are sometimes shocked when I say children's picture books are how white supremacy is reproduced. But if all the books that you're showing your children feature the same person over and over and over again, and that's, a white cisgender child who doesn't have disabilities, then you're really not preparing your child to live in a world that is incredibly and increasingly diverse.
Wonderful. What gaps in the current children's book publishing industry stand out to you most?
Well, I confess I don't read a whole lot of children's literature. I don't have kids. I don't teach children's literature. But I definitely think we need more books that feature Black queer protagonists. I'd love to see more intersectionality, so that if we have a book about a child with a disability, they can be of color. Different configurations of families. I know I never saw a family like mine in a book when I was growing up, because my parents divorced. My father had remarried twice. I had half siblings. I had step siblings. It was messy, and I didn't see enough of that in the books that I was reading. I think there are so many, unfortunately, in this country, homeless children. I don't see them represented in the literature, and they ought to be. Rural kids, definitely as well. I would love to see more books confronting climate change and children's activism, because all these movements against climate change and gun control, and even for reproductive rights, it's young people leading the way. So I'd love to see more books that show young people as leaders.
Powerful. And I would like all of you to start thinking of questions. This is my last one. And then if any of you have questions, if you could come up to the mic. So here's your last question from the virtual audience. How does your feminist identity come through in your writing, particularly in the Dragons in the Bag series? And are there plans for more on the series or companion books?
Well, book 5 will be out in
Right,
May
I saw
of
that.
next year. I started writing a prequel, and then at Christmas, I ended up working on a picture book about Mansa Musa and Balthazar. So I will get back to the prequel hopefully this fall, and that will come out. It has to be a year after the 5th book, so that would be 2025, I guess. Being a Black feminist means that I had to realize I couldn't just focus on women and girls. If I wanted to end violence against women and girls, I had to start with the perpetrators. And starting with men wasn't really the best option, because they were sort of already formed. It was challenging. I found that in my college classrooms when I was teaching Black masculinities. But I realized that if we gave boys more opportunities to express their emotions, to be fully human, to be vulnerable, to be leaders, to be engaged learners, that would help change the culture. And so for me, the Dragons in a Bag series is sort of the same book I keep writing over and over and over again. You know, a young boy who has lost a parent and is trying to keep his family together, is more knowledgeable than his remaining parent realizes. He's looking for mentorship, he's looking for guidance, he's looking to be recognized for the contributions he can make. And that's who Jax is. I wasn't particularly interested in just focusing on one child, so I developed a cast of characters. His best friend Vic ends up being a strong storyteller. Of course, Vic's little sister Kavi tells most of book 2. I loved having alternating viewpoints so that kids could see the ways in which these characters are similar and different. But yeah, as a feminist, you know, it's just my obligation, my responsibility to encourage children, to empower children to explore their fullest humanity. And it is really frustrating to live in a patriarchal, misogynistic society where boys are punished for showing their emotions. Every single day, it seems, we look not only in our country, it's mostly in our country, you know, boys who are frustrated and angry and upset and isolated and alone, and all they know to do is reach for a gun to feel more powerful. We just had a shooter in Atlanta targeting women. If we want to change things, we have to change the culture. And, you know, a 5-book series of children's books isn't going to do that on its own. But yeah, I realized I started out writing for teenagers. I was always writing about Black teenage girls. And then I realized I had to have non-binary characters. I had to have transgender characters. I had to broaden my vision of the kinds of people we need in our community who can help us create change.
Any questions from the audience? Would you like, could you come up and to the mic, please? This is being streamed, so that.
Hello, thank you for coming to speak to us tonight.
Hi, thanks for coming out.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk. One part of your talk that really resonated with me was you talking about going to Scotland, especially first as a teenager, and being kind of like, and you mentioned that like you're really susceptible to beauty, and kind of being in Scotland and falling in love with the country and in love with the mythology and in love with the idea of it. And that really resonated with me because I love mythology. I love stories, and all the mythology that we have open to us, or that's most easy to access, is Celtic mythology, Norse mythology, classics, ancient Greek and Roman. And so from people who were kind of like the victors and the powerful in history, and who exploited others and exploited people who look like me. And so one thing I would love to hear you speak more about is, when you're someone who has a love for history and a love for mythology, and you love going to beautiful places and experiencing them, how do you kind of like temper loving that? And you also talked about that with your love of British literature. How do you temper loving that with remembering kind of like the uglier parts of history and the parts of history and mythology that bring you rage, especially when you remember, or I find that I remember like, oh, I don't know the mythology or the pantheons of people who look like me, or the people of sub-Saharan Africa had mythology that was every bit as rich and beautiful as any Greek myth, but there's not like myriads of children's books or myriads of books that are about those mythologies. And I'm so sad about that. Or even feeling sad knowing, oh, they're like people of color from all over the world have struggled, but people from maybe East Asian cultures or South Asian cultures or Middle Eastern cultures can access their mythology, but a lot of Indigenous and Black peoples have had those erased. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. That's an excellent one. So I would say, since you have a piece of paper, make sure you write down or take note of this person's name. B, the initial B, Charisse Moore. She's a fantastic author, Black woman living in Maryland, I think, and she has a book coming out, which is, I'm not sure it's a bestiary, but it's at least a sort of collection of mythological creatures from the African continent. She has compiled this compendium and it's going to be excellent. And I wish I had it. I did find a fairy atlas when I was in Portree. And to my surprise, the reason I bought it was because it had, here are the fairies of Asia. Here are the fairies of Oceania. Here are the fairies of Africa. So things are slowly changing. Black writers have always been writing about African mythology. They just have struggled to get publishing deals. There's a whole genre. Gosh, somebody help me. Swords and, is that it? Swords and sorcery. There's a whole genre. Milton Davis would be an excellent place to start. He's an independent publisher and he specifically, I mean, he writes a lot of it himself, but he also publishes people who are writing African-based mythology. He also published Charisse's novel, The Marvelous World of Dr. Jin. Is if you just Google her name or Milton Davis, you'll pull up all of it. So those books are out there. You have to look a lot harder to find them. I think publishers clearly have found out that Yoruba mythology sells, you know, thanks to some of the more popular books, Tomi Adeyomi, sorry, mispronouncing their name. So you can find those series. Rena Barron is here in Chicago and she has an excellent series. For middle graders, Maya and the Rising Dark, and then the young adult, Help Me, Collector of Souls. That's one of them. It's a trilogy. So there are people doing those books and it helps me. Reading Rena's novels really helped me. Reading Charisse's work helped me to sort of dabble in the Dragons in a Bag series in adding African mythology. It feels awkward and uncomfortable. But that's sort of the point, right? Like it's awkward and uncomfortable because of that rupture, because of the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade, because we had our culture stripped from us. So I think what I would say in response to your question is that what I try to do is to have compassion for myself. That's what I try to do. I get very, very angry sometimes. And then I make a mug of Milo or a cup of tea and I have some hobnobs. Like, my home is full of British food. I subscribe to 3 or 4 different British channels. I have been watching I watch Sky News every night, but you know, I have family members who are going to take that pledge to the King of England tomorrow.
Right.
I'm certainly not going to, but you know, I try to have compassion. I try to have space for all of it because the truth is, you know, the folks in St. Kitts Nevis, if they were to have a referendum, they're not going to get rid of the monarchy. In Canada, they're not going to vote to get rid of the monarchy. Like we have to live with this legacy. We have to live with it and go forward with it. So I think it's almost like being in an abusive relationship in a way, right? Like that kind of power dynamic is extremely complicated. And you have someone that you love, someone that has made you love them in a really manipulative, complex way, but you can't just walk away. Like it's really hard, especially, you know, I would use the analogy of a family, right? Like, what do you do when the people you love hurt you? It's really a difficult decision. And I think whatever you decide you need to do in each particular moment is what you need to do and what you give yourself permission to do. So if you still want to, I'm working on a Viking novel. I've been working on a Viking novel for like 5 years, Black Vikings. And, you know, I did research in Aberdeen because there's all kinds of Viking stuff in Scotland. So, you know, I will be back in Scotland doing research on my Viking novel. So I think we can still take the things that we love. I mean, I wish I had known when I was a child reading, you know, Narnia and The Secret Garden and all those books. I wish I had known that there have been Africans in England since before the Romans. Like, Africans got around. We've always been there. I was such a medieval geek. I still am a medieval geek. The Middle Ages included Africa, right? Like, why did we start having Balthazar represented as a Black man in depictions of the Nativity? Could it have to do with Mansa Musa, going on Hajj, on pilgrimage, and having the price of gold drop because he was spending so much money wherever he went? Like, there are all these histories that we don't know, but it's not too late to discover them, right? I used to really beat myself up for not knowing things by the time I was 21. I got to graduate school and it felt like everybody knew so much more than me. And they did, because they grew up in the United States, and many of them attended Black high schools and had Black educators. I didn't have that advantage, but I did get a very good English education in Canada, good colonial education, and I will use every bit of it to destroy them if I need to.
On that note, on that note, thank you so much. The bewitching hour is now, so I have just a few remarks in closing. Before we leave, on behalf of the Sutherland Committee, I'd like to express our sincere and heartfelt thanks to Betsy Hearn and Roger Sutton, who retired from the committee after many years of service. We will miss them both very, very much. In addition, we'd like to express our thanks to two people here at the Chicago Public Library who are behind the scenes, Robin Willard and Alexa Hamilton, whose technological and organizational skills made this lecture possible. And moving on, we can continue our conversations in the grand lobby on the first floor of the library, where a beautiful reception is now held. Thank you for attending, and we hope you will join us next year on May 3rd, when our 41st Sutherland Lecture will be given by the 2023-2024 National Ambassador of Young People's Literature, Meg Medina. So thank you and good night.